I'm Pat Tully from the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. Today I'm reading the first part of a short story by Edith Wharton, entitled The Other Two. Edith Wharton was born in 1862 to a wealthy New York society family, and she spent part of her childhood in Europe. Despite her family's disapproval, it was not considered proper for women of her class to write for publication. Wharton was extraordinarily productive through her life, writing short stories, poetry, plays, and translations of others' works. She's best known for her novels that subtly criticize New York and Newport society, including The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence. And of course, many of us have read Ethan Frome in high school, A Tale of Extramarital Love Gone Horribly Wrong. So let's get started with The Other Two, which was published in 1904. 1. Waythorn, on the drawing room hearth, waited for his wife to come down to dinner. It was their first night under his own roof, and he was surprised at his thrill of boyish agitation. He was not so old, to be sure. His glass gave him little more than the 35 years to which his wife confessed, but he had fancied himself already in the temperate zone. Yet here he was listening for her step with the tender sense of all it symbolized. With some old trail of verse about garlanded nuptial door posts floating through his enjoyment of the pleasant room and the good dinner just beyond it. They had been hastily recalled from their honeymoon by the illness of Lily Haskett, the child of Mrs. Waythorn's first marriage. The little girl, at Waythorn's desire, had been transferred to his house on the day of his mother's wedding, and the doctor, on their arrival, broke the news that she was ill with typhoid, but declared that all the symptoms were favorable. Lily could show 12 years of unblemished health, and the case promised to be a light one. The nurse spoke as reassuringly, and after a moment of alarm, Mrs. Waythorn had adjusted herself to the situation. She was very fond of Lily. Her affection for the child had perhaps been her decisive charm in Waythorn's eyes, but she had the perfectly balanced nerves which her little girl had inherited, and no woman ever wasted less tissue in unproductive worry. Waythorn was therefore quite prepared to see her come in presently, a little late because of a last look at Lily, but as serene and well-appointed as if her good-night kiss had been laid on the brow of health. Her composure was restful to him. It acted as a ballast to his somewhat unstable sensibilities. As he pictured her bending over the child's bed, he thought how soothing her presence must be in illness. Her very step would prognosticate recovery. His own life had been a gray one, from temperament rather than circumstance, and he had been drawn to her by the unperturbed gaiety which kept her fresh and elastic at an age when most women's activities were growing either slack or febrile. He knew what was said about her, for, popular as she was, there had always been a faint undercurrent of detraction. When she had appeared in New York 9 or 10 years earlier, as the pretty Mrs. Haskett, whom Gus Varick had unearthed somewhere, was it in Pittsburgh or Utica? Society, while promptly accepting her, had reserved the right to cast a doubt on its own discrimination. Inquiry, however, established her undoubted connection with a socially reigning family, and explained by her recent divorce as the natural result of a runaway match at 17. And as nothing was known of Mr. Haskett, it was easy to believe the worst of him. Alice Haskett's remarriage with Gus Varick was a passport to the set whose recognition she coveted, and for a few years the Varicks were the most popular couple in town. Unfortunately, the alliance was brief and stormy, and this time the husband had his champions. Still, even Varick's staunchest supporters admitted that he was not meant for matrimony, and Mrs. Varick's grievances were of a nature to bear the inspection of the New York courts. A New York divorce is in itself a diploma of virtue, and in the semi-widowhood of this second separation, Mrs. Varick took on an air of sanctity, and was allowed to confide her wrongs to some of the most scrupulous ears in town. But when it was known that she was to marry Waythorn, there was a momentary reaction. Her best friends would have preferred to see her remain in the role of the injured wife, which was as becoming to her as crepe to a rosy complexion. True, a decent time had elapsed, and it was not even suggested that Waythorn had supplanted his predecessor. Still, people shook their heads over him, and one grudging friend, to whom he affirmed that he took this step with his eyes open, replied oracularly, "Yes, and with your ears shut." Waythorn could afford to smile at these innuendos. In the Wall Street phrase, he had discounted them. He knew that society has not yet adapted itself to the consequences of divorce, and that till the adaptation takes place, every woman who uses the freedom the law accords her must be her own social justification. Waythorn had an amused confidence in his wife's ability to justify herself. His expectations were fulfilled, and before the wedding took place, Alice Varick's group had rallied openly to her support. She took it all imperturbably. She had a way of surmounting obstacles without seeming to be aware of them. And Waythorn looked back with wonder at the trivialities over which he had worn his nerves thin. He had the sense of having found refuge in a richer, warmer nature than his own, and his satisfaction at the moment was humorously summed up in the thought that his wife, when she had done all she could for Lily, would not be ashamed to come down and enjoy a good dinner. The anticipation of such enjoyment was not, however, the sentiment expressed by Mrs. Waythorn's charming face when she presently joined him. Though she had put on her most engaging tea gown, she had neglected to assume the smile that went with it, and Waythorn thought he had never seen her look so nearly worried. "What is it?" he asked. "Is anything wrong with Lily?" "No, I've just been there, and she's still sleeping." Mrs. Waythorn hesitated. "But something tiresome has happened." He had taken her two hands, and now perceived that he was crushing a paper between them. "This letter?" "Yes. Mr. Haskett has written. His lawyer has written." Haythorn felt himself flush uncomfortably. He dropped his wife's hands. "What about?" "About seeing Lily. You know the courts." Yes, he interrupted nervously. Nothing was known about Haskett in New York. He was vaguely supposed to have remained in the outer darkness from which his wife had been rescued, and Waythorn was one of the few who were aware that he had given up his business in Utica and followed her to New York in order to be near his little girl. In the days of his wooing, Waythorn had often met Lily on the doorstep, rosy and smiling, on her way to see Papa. "I am so sorry," Mrs. Waythorn murmured. He roused himself. "What does he want?" "He wants to see her. You know she goes to him once a week." "Well, he doesn't expect her to go to him now, does he?" "No. He has heard of her illness, but he expects to come here." "Here?" Mrs. Waythorn reddened under his gaze. They looked away from each other. "I'm afraid he has the right. You'll see." She made a proffer of the letter. Waythorn moved away with a gesture of refusal. He stood staring about the softly lighted room, which a moment before had seemed so full of bridal intimacy. "I'm so sorry," she repeated. "If Lily could have been moved—" "That's out of the question," he returned impatiently. "I suppose so." Her lip was beginning to tremble, and he felt himself a brute. "He must come, of course," he said. "When is his day?" "I'm afraid tomorrow." "Very well. Send a note in the morning." The butler entered to announce dinner. Waythorn turned to his wife. "Come, you must be tired. It's beastly, but try to forget about it," he said, drawing her hand through his arm. "You're so good, dear. I'll try," she whispered back. Her face cleared at once, and as she looked at him across the flowers, between the rosy candle shades, He saw her lips waver back into a smile. "How pretty everything is," she sighed luxuriously. He turned to the butler. "The champagne at once, please. Mrs. Waythorn is tired." In a moment or two their eyes met above the sparkling glasses. Her own were quite clear and untroubled. He saw that she had obeyed his injunction and forgotten. 2. Waythorn, the next morning, went downtown earlier than usual. Haskett was not likely to come until the afternoon, but the instinct of flight drove him forth. He meant to stay away all day. He had thoughts of dining at his club. As his door closed behind him, he reflected that before he opened it again, he would have admitted another man who had as much right to enter it as himself, and the thought filled him with a physical repugnance. He caught the elevated at the employees' hour and found himself crushed between two layers of pendulous humanity. At 8th Street, the man facing him wriggled out and another took his place. Waythorn glanced up and saw that it was Gus Varick. The men were so close together that it was impossible to ignore the smile of recognition on Varick's handsome, overblown face. And after all, why not? They had always been on good terms, and Varick had been divorced before Waythorn's attentions to his wife began. The two exchanged a word on the perennial grievance of the congested trains, and when a seat at their side was miraculously left empty, the instinct of self-preservation made Waythorn slip into it after Varick. The latter drew the stout man's breath of relief. "Lord, I was beginning to feel like a pressed flower." He leaned back, looked unconcernedly at Waythorn. "Sorry to hear that Sellers is knocked out again." "Sellers?" echoed Waythorn, starting at his partner's name. Varick looked surprised. "You didn't know he was laid up with the gout?" "No, I've been away. I only got back last night." Waythorn felt himself reddening in anticipation of the other's smile. "Ah, yes, to be sure. And Sellers' attack came on 2 days ago. I'm afraid he's pretty bad. Very awkward for me, as it happens, because he was just putting through a rather important thing for me." "Ah?" Waythorn wondered vaguely, since when Varick had been dealing in important things. Hitherto he had dabbled only in the shallow pools of speculation, with which Waythorn's office did not usually concern itself. It occurred to him that Varick might be talking at random, to relieve the strain of their propinquity. That strain was becoming momentarily more apparent to Waythorn when, at Cortlandt Street, he caught sight of an acquaintance, and had a sudden vision of the picture that he and Varick must present to an initiated eye. He jumped up with a muttered excuse. "I hope you'll find Sellers better," said Varick civilly, and he stammered back, "if I can be of any use to you," and let the departing crowd sweep him to the platform. At his office he heard that Sellers was in fact ill with the gout, and would probably not be able to leave the house for some weeks. "I'm sorry it should have happened so, Mr. Waythorn," the senior clerk said with affable significance. "Mr. Sellers was very much upset at the idea of giving you such a lot of extra work just now." "Oh, that's no matter," said Waythorn hastily. He secretly welcomed the pressure of additional business, and was glad to think that, when the day's work was over, he would have to call at his partner's on his way home. He was late for luncheon and turned in at the nearest restaurant instead of going to his club. The place was full, and the waiter hurried him to the back of the room to capture the only vacant table. In the cloud of cigar smoke, Waythorn did not at once distinguish his neighbors, but presently, looking about him, he saw Varick seated a few feet off. This time, luckily, they were too far apart for conversation, and Varick, who had faced another way, had probably not even seen him, but there was an irony in their renewed nearness. Varick was said to be fond of good living, and as Waythorn sat dispatching his hurried luncheon, he looked half enviously at the other's leisurely degustation of his meal. When Waythorn first saw him, he had been helping himself with critical deliberation to a bit of camembert at the ideal point of liquefaction, and now, the cheese removed, he was just pouring his café double from its little 2-storied earthen pot. He poured slowly, his ruddy profile bent above the task, and one beringed white hand steadying the lip of the coffee pot. And then he stretched his other hand to the decanter of cognac at his elbow, filled a liqueur glass, took a tentative sip, and poured the brandy into his coffee cup. Waythorn watched him in a kind of fascination. What was he thinking of? Only of the flavor of the coffee and the liqueur? Had the morning's meeting left no more trace in his thoughts than on his face? Had his wife so completely passed out of his life that even this odd encounter with her present husband, within a week after her remarriage, was no more than an incident in his day? And as Waythorn mused, another idea struck him. Had Haskett ever met Varick, as Varick and he had just met? The recollection of Haskett perturbed him, and he rose and left the restaurant, taking a circuitous way out to escape the placid irony of Varick's nod. It was after 7 when Waythorn reached home. He thought the footman who opened the door looked at him oddly. "How is Miss Lily?" he asked in haste. "Doing very well, sir. A gentleman. Tell Barlow to put off dinner for half an hour." Waythorn cut him off, hurrying upstairs. He went straight to his room and dressed without seeing his wife. When he reached the drawing room, she was there, fresh and radiant. Lily's day had been good. The doctor was not coming back that evening. At dinner, Waythorn told her of Sellers' illness and of the resulting complications. She listened sympathetically, adjuring him not to let himself be overworked, and asking vague, feminine questions about the routine of the office. Then she gave him the chronicle of Lily's day, quoted the nurse and the doctor, and told him who had called to inquire. He had never seen her more serene and unruffled. It struck him with a curious pang that she was very happy in being with him, so happy that she found a childish pleasure in rehearsing the trivial incidents of her day. After dinner they went to the library, and the servant put the coffee and liqueurs on a low table before her and left the room. She looked singularly soft and girlish in her rosy pale dress, against the dark leather of one of his bachelor armchairs. A day earlier the contrast would have charmed him. He turned away now, choosing a cigar with affected deliberation. "Did Haskett come?" he asked, with his back to her. "Oh, yes, he came." "You didn't see him, of course." She hesitated a moment. "I let the nurse see him." That was all. There was nothing more to ask. He swung round toward her, applying a match to his cigar. Well, the thing was over for a week at any rate. He would try not to think about it. She looked up at him, a trifle rosier than usual, with a smile in her eyes. "Ready for your coffee, dear?" He leaned against the mantelpiece, watching her as she lifted the coffee pot. The lamplight struck a gleam from her bracelets and tipped her soft hair with brightness. How light and slender she was, and how each gesture flowed into the next. She seemed a creature all compact of harmonies. As the thought of Haskell receded, Waythorn felt himself yielding again to the joy of possessorship. They were his, those white hands with their flitting motions, his the light haze of hair, the lips, the eyes. She set down the coffee pot, and reaching for the decanter of cognac, measured off a liqueur glass and poured it into his cup. Waythorn uttered a sudden exclamation. "What's the matter?" she said, startled. "Nothing, only I don't take cognac in my coffee." "Oh, how stupid of me," she cried. Their eyes met, and she blushed a sudden, agonized red. 3. 10 days later, Mr. Sellers, still housebound, asked Waythorn to call on his way downtown. The senior partner, with his swaddled foot propped up by the fire, greeted his associate with an air of embarrassment. "I'm sorry, my dear fellow, I've got to ask you to do an awkward thing for me." Waythorn waited, and the other went on, after a pause apparently given to the arrangement of his phrases. "The fact is, when I was knocked out, I had just got into a rather complicated piece of business for Gus Varick." "Well," said Waythorn, with an attempt to put him at his ease. "Well, it's this way. Varick came to see me the day before my attack. He had evidently had an inside tip from somebody, and had made about 100,000. He came to me for advice, and I suggested his going in with Vanderlyn." "Oh, the deuce," Waythorn exclaimed. He saw in a flash what had happened. The investment was an alluring one, but required negotiation. He listened intently while Sellers put the case before him, and the statement ended. He said, "You think I have to see Varick?" "I'm afraid I can't as yet. The doctor is obdurate, and this thing can't wait. I hate to ask you, but no one else in the office knows the ins and outs of it." Waythorn stood silent. He did not care a farthing for the success of Varick's venture, but the honor of the office was to be considered, and he could hardly refuse to oblige his partner. "Very well," he said. "I'll do it." That afternoon, apprised by telephone, Varick called at the office. Waythorn, waiting in his private room, wondered what the others thought of it. The newspapers at the time of Mrs. Waythorn's marriage had acquainted their readers with every detail of her previous matrimonial ventures, and Waythorn could fancy the clerk smiling behind Varick's back as he was ushered in. Varick bore himself admirably. He was easy without being undignified, and Waythorn was conscious of cutting a much less impressive figure. Varick had no head for business, and the talk prolonged itself for nearly an hour, while Waythorn set forth with scrupulous precision the details of the proposed transaction. "I'm awfully obliged to you," Varick said as he rose. "The fact is, I'm not used to having much money to look after, and I don't want to make an ass of myself." He smiled, and Waythorn could not help noticing that there was something pleasant about his smile. "It feels uncommonly queer to have enough cash to pay one's bills. I'd have sold my soul for it a few years ago." Waythorn winced at the allusion. He had heard it rumored that a lack of funds had been one of the determining causes of the Varick separation, but it did not occur to him that Varick's words were intentional. It seemed more likely that the desire to keep clear of embarrassing topics had fatally drawn him into one. Waythorn did not wish to be outdone in civility. "We'll do the best we can for you," he said. "I think this is a good thing you're in." "Oh, I'm sure it's immense. It's awfully good of you," Varick broke off, embarrassed. "I suppose the thing's settled now, but if anything happens before Sellers is about, I'll see you again," said Waythorn quietly. He was glad, in the end, to appear the more self-possessed of the two. The course of Lily's illness ran smooth, and as the days passed, Waythorn grew used to the idea of Haskett's weekly visit. The first time the day came around, he stayed out late and questioned his wife as to the visit on his return. She replied at once that Haskett had merely seen the nurse downstairs, as the doctor did not wish anyone in the child's sick room until after the crisis. The following week, Waythorn was again conscious of the recurrence of the day, but had forgotten it by the time he came home to dinner. The crisis of the disease came a few days later, with a rapid decline of fever, and the little girl was pronounced out of danger. In the rejoicing which ensued, the thought of Haskett passed out of Waythorn's mind, and one afternoon, letting himself into the house with a latchkey, he went straight to his library without noticing a shabby hat and umbrella in the hall. In the library he found a small, effaced-looking man with a thinnish gray beard sitting on the edge of a chair. The stranger might have been a piano tuner, or one of those mysteriously efficient persons who are summoned in emergencies to adjust some detail of the domestic machinery. He blinked at Waythorn through a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles and said mildly, "Mr. Waythorn, I presume? I am Lily's father." Waythorn flushed. "Oh," he stammered uncomfortably. He broke off, disliking to appear rude. Inwardly, he was trying to adjust the actual Haskett to the image of him projected by his wife's reminiscences. Waythorn had been allowed to infer that Alice's first husband was a brute. "I'm sorry to intrude," said Haskett, with his over-the-counter politeness. "Don't mention it," returned Waythorn, collecting himself. "I suppose the nurse has been told." "I presume so. I can wait," said Haskett. He had a resigned way of speaking, as though life had worn down his natural powers of resistance. Waythorn stood on the threshold, nervously pulling off his gloves. "I'm sorry you've been detained. I will send for the nurse," he said, and as he opened the door he added with an effort, "I'm glad we can give you a good report of Lily." He winced as the "we" slipped out, but Haskett seemed not to notice it. "Thank you, Mr. Waythorn. It has been an anxious time for me." "Ah, well, that's past. Soon she'll be able to go to you." Waythorn nodded and passed out. In his own room, he flung himself down with a groan. He hated the womanish sensibility which made him suffer so acutely from the grotesque chances of life. He had known when he married that his wife's former husbands were both living, and that amid the multiplied contacts of modern existence, there were 1,000 chances to one that he would run against one or the other. Yet he found himself as much disturbed by his brief encounter with Haskett as though the law had not obligingly removed all difficulties in the way of their meeting. Waythorn sprang up and began to pace the room nervously. He had not suffered half so much from his 2 meetings with Varick. It was Haskett's presence in his own house that made the situation so intolerable. He stood still, hearing steps in the passage. "This way, please," he heard the nurse say. Haskett was being taken upstairs then. Not a corner of the house but was open to him. Waythorn dropped into another chair, staring vaguely ahead of him. On his dressing table stood a photograph of Alice, taken when he had first known her. She was Alice Varick then. How fine and exquisite he had thought her. Those were Varick's pearls around her neck. At Waythorn's instance, they had been returned before her marriage. Had Haskett ever given her any trinkets? And what had become of them, Waythorn wondered. He realized suddenly that he knew very little of Haskett's past or present situation. But from the man's appearance and manner of speech, he could reconstruct with curious precision the surroundings of Alice's first marriage. And it startled him to think that she had, in the background of her life, a phase of existence so different from anything which he had connected her. Varick, whatever his faults, was a gentleman in the conventional, traditional sense of the term, the sense which at that moment seemed, oddly enough, to have the most meaning to Waythorn. He and Varick had the same social habits, they spoke the same language, understood the same allusions. But this other man, it was grotesquely uppermost in Waythorn's mind that Haskett had worn a made-up tie attached with an elastic. Why should that ridiculous detail symbolize the whole man? Waythorn was exasperated by his own paltriness, but the fact of the tie expanded, forced itself on him, became as it were the key to Alice's past. He could see her as Mrs. Haskett, sitting in a front parlor, furnished in plush, with a pianola and a copy of Ben-Hur on the center table. He could see her going to the theater with Haskett, or perhaps even to a church sociable, she in a picture hat and Haskett in a black frock coat, a little creased, and with the made-up tie on an elastic. On the way home, they would stop and look at the illuminated shop windows, lingering over the photographs of New York actresses. On Sunday afternoons, Haskett would take her for a walk, pushing Lily ahead of them in a white enameled perambulator, and Waythorn had a vision of the people they would stop and talk to. He could fancy how pretty Alice must have looked, in a dress adroitly constructed from the hints of a New York fashion paper. How she must have looked down on the other women, chafing at her life, and secretly feeling that she belonged in a bigger place. For the moment, his foremost thought was one of wonder at the way in which she had shed the phase of existence which her marriage with Haskett implied. It was as if her whole aspect, every gesture, every inflection, every allusion, were a studied negation of that period of her life. If she had denied being married to Haskett, she could hardly have stood more convicted of duplicity than in this obliteration of the self which had been his wife. Waythorn started up, checking himself in the analysis of her motives. What right had he to create a fantastic effigy of her and then pass judgment on it? She had spoken vaguely of her first marriage as unhappy, had hinted becoming reticence that Haskett had wrought havoc among her young illusions. It was a pity for Waythorn's peace of mind that Haskett's very inoffensiveness shed a new light on the nature of those illusions. A man would rather think that his wife has been brutalized by her first husband than that that process has been reversed. So I will stop there in the story, The Other Two by Edith Wharton. I'll see you again next week. Thank you for listening.